Imagine a room in the heart of the Vatican, where the air is so thick with the scent of beeswax and old blood that it catches in your throat. On a massive walnut table, 3 items lie in the flickering candlelight: a golden papal tiara, a curved steel dagger stained with the mud of the Romagna, and a silken wedding veil frayed at the edges. These are not just objects. They are the balance sheet of a family that attempted to buy Italy and pay for it with the soul of the church. Watch as a man in scarlet robes, Rodrigo Borgia, meticulously counts stacks of gold ducats while his rivals vanish into the Tiber's dark waters. See his son, Cesare, trading his cardinal's hat for a suit of black armor, galloping across a landscape of burning cities to carve a kingdom out of chaos. And look closely at his daughter, Lucrezia, a girl whose smile was used to seal treaties and whose tears were the hidden cost of every Borgia merger. The House of Borgia did not just rule. They operated. They treated the papacy like a private bank, the College of Cardinals like a board of directors, and the map of Europe like a ledger to be rewritten with every stroke of a poisoned pen. They were history's most brilliant and most bankrupt startup, a dynasty that rose like a meteor, only to find that when you build an empire on fear and gold, the only thing more certain than your ascent is the absolute finality of your fall. Today, we open the secret ledgers of the Vatican. We look past the myths of poison and incest to find something far more fascinating: a family of master strategists who gambled everything on the present, only to be foreclosed upon by history. Welcome to the ultimate audit of the House of Borgia. Chapter 1. The $200 million IPO, Hijacking the Vatican. The story of the Borgia dynasty is an operatic descent into the forbidden, power wielded with sacred cruelty, fortunes forged through corruption, and papal intrigue dripping with poison. Originating in Valencia as the ambitious yet provincial Borgia family, their ascent onto the world stage began in 1455 when Alonso de Borja was consecrated as Pope Calixtus III. This was merely the overture. The true storm of the Renaissance swirled under his nephew, Rodrigo. Crowned Pope Alexander VI in 1492, Rodrigo understood that the pontiff's chair was the ultimate throne. His coffers swelled to a modern-day estimate of $200 million, a vast, obscene fortune generated not from gold mines, but from papal taxes, the systematic sale of indulgences, strategic Italian estates, and tightly controlled Spanish trade routes. The church became the world's most powerful corporate entity, and the Borgias were the ultimate shareholders. Alexander's children, Cesare, Lucrezia, Juan, and Joffre, were the ruthless instruments of his domination. They turned this spiritual wealth into temporal power, forging alliances through cold steel and cunning marriages, all while commissioning the masterpieces that still define the Vatican's splendor. Yet, beneath the gilded altars and soaring frescoes, the air was thick with whispered sins, incest rumors, midnight poisonings, the sudden, silent vanishing of rivals, and conspiracies that rattled the thrones of Europe, foreshadowing the treachery of the Tudors and the doom of the Romanovs, their enemies. Like the master of ceremonies, Johann Burchard chronicled tales of the banquet of chestnuts, an orgy with 50 courtesans crawling on the floor. While sensational, modern scholars view this as the fake news of the 15th century, exaggerated to weaponize morality against a political rival. Their shadow still scandalizes scholars and electrifies modern audiences, though their political grip crumbled almost instantly after 1503. The Borgia blend of spectacular corruption, high culture, and utter lack of moral restraint forged a legend that refuses to yield to history. To understand their reign is to unlock the hidden, blood-stained chambers of the Vatican. But that $200 million empire didn't materialize out of thin air. To understand how the Borgias hijacked the Vatican, we must travel back to the sun-drenched tile roofs of Valencia, where a new money family was busy learning the ultimate art of the deal: how to turn provincial silver into a golden ticket to eternal power. Chapter 2. New Money. The art of the deal. Long before the name Borgia became a whispered curse in the corridors of the Vatican, it was simply Borja, a name that carried the scent of sun-bleached tiles and the salt air of the Spanish coast. Picture Valencia in the early 1400s, a city of vibrant markets where the fragrance of ripening citrus groves mingled with the smell of fresh ink and the rhythmic clatter of caravels arriving from unknown horizons. In this world of ambitious merchants and rising nobles, the Borgia clan was busy counting their silver. This was not the quiet, ancient wealth of kings. It was a restless, aggressive fortune built on calculated risks and sharp eyes. The Borgias were masters of the hustle, people who understood the rhythm of the harvest and the flow of the trade routes. They were the architects of their own ascent, leveraging every minor title and every fertile acre of Spanish land to climb the social ladder. They were new people in an old world, a family that knew how to buy lua mi when it was cheap and sell it when the world was hungry. But they also knew a darker truth. In the eyes of the great European dynasties, all the gold in Valencia could not erase the fact that they were still outsiders, provincial upstarts, looking in through the stained glass windows of power. The family's destiny shifted not through a sword, but through a mind. Alonso de Borgia, a man with a tongue as sharp as his intellect, looked toward Rome, the shimmering, eternal city that stood as the ultimate prize of Christendom. He didn't just study the laws of the church, he mastered the unspoken rules of the game. By 1455, through decades of patience and a relentless will, he stood upon the throne of St. Peter as Pope Calixtus III. Overnight, the family performed its first great act of magic. To survive in the treacherous world of Italian politics, they had to shed their skin. The Spanish Borgia disappeared, and in its place emerged the Italian Borgia. They draped themselves in the finest silks of the peninsula, adopted the local cadence, and began to weave their identity into the very fabric of Rome. It was a transformation so swift it left their rivals breathless. The crimson bull of their family crest, once a symbol of Spanish grit, was now being stamped onto the wax of papal decrees and painted onto the high ceilings of palaces. However, the Borgias soon discovered that while you can change your name, you cannot easily change your blood. To the ancient Italian dynasties, they remained the barbarians, foreigners who had dared to hijack the most sacred office in the world. Their enemies, led by figures of cold hatred like Giuliano della Rovere, began to weave a shadow around the family, birthing the Black Legend. This was a sophisticated smear campaign that portrayed the Borgias as secret outsiders whose faith was as thin as the silk they wore, turning their political maneuvers into historical sins. But were they truly monster or simply hated outsiders? In reality, the Borgias were no more brutal than the Medici or the Sforzas. Their unforgivable sin was not murder, but their Spanish blood. To the native Italian clans, they were Marranos and invaders who had stolen the keys to Rome. Instead of retreating, the Borgias doubled down. Among them was a young man named Rodrigo, who watched his uncle Alonso's every move with clinical precision. He didn't just learn the prayers, he mastered the choreography of the court. He saw how a single signature could move armies, and how a well-placed gift could silence a critic. Rodrigo internalized the ultimate Roman lesson, that power was a performance, and the stage belonged to whoever acted with the most audacity. By the time Rodrigo was ready to claim his own place in history, the family was no longer a group of Spanish immigrants. They were a force of nature. They had successfully pivoted from the dusty orchards of Valencia to the gilded halls of the Vatican, transforming their aggressive provincial drive into an authority that claimed to speak for God. The stage was set, the new money was now cloaked in ancient tradition, and the world was about to learn that the Borgias weren't just joining the game, they were about to rewrite every single rule. If the rise of the Borgias in Valencia was the prologue, their arrival in the heart of Rome was the moment the stage lights truly ignited. Rodrigo Borgia, now Pope Alexander VI, did not see the Vatican as a humble sanctuary. He saw it as the ultimate fortress of a family-run empire. To the outside world, he was the vicar of Christ, the spiritual father of millions. But behind the heavy oak doors of his private study, Alexander was the chairman of a global enterprise, and his children, Cesare, Lucrezia, and Juan, were his primary shareholders, each assigned a specific, high-stakes role in the family's survival. The wealth they commanded was staggering, reaching a modern-day estimate of $200 million. Yet, this was not gold sitting stagnant in a vault. It was a living, breathing portfolio. Alexander professionalized the collection of papal taxes, turning the devotion of Europe into a vast, Organized revenue stream. He optimized the sale of indulgences, the promises of divine forgiveness, with the precision of a master merchant, ensuring that every prayer and every confession added a coin to the Borgia treasury. This constant flow of capital allowed the family to act not just as leaders, but as owners of the Italian landscape. They bought loyalty with bishoprics and secured territories with the sheer weight of their coffers. In this grand design, Lucrezia was the family's most delicate and dangerous asset. She was the merger and acquisition specialist of the Renaissance. Through her, Alexander negotiated the most critical alliances of the age. Every marriage was a treaty signed in blood and gold. When they needed the military support of Milan, she was wed to the Sforzas. When that alliance grew cold, she was reclaimed. Her first marriage annulled with a single stroke of her father's pen, making her a liquid asset once again, ready to be reinvested into a more profitable union. She moved through the corridors of power with a grace that masked a terrifying truth. In the House of Borgia, love was never a personal choice. It was a political currency. Meanwhile, Cesare and Juan represented the two different faces of the family's hard power. Juan, the favored son, was given the command of the papal armies. His title of Gonfalonier meant to broadcast the family's physical dominance. Cesare, however, was the strategist in the shadows, initially trapped in the scarlet robes of a cardinal, but already dreaming of steel. Together, they formed the executive board of the Borgia machine. While Juan paraded through the streets as the face of military glory, Cesare watched from the balconies, calculating the market value of every rival noble and every fortified city in the Romagna. But Alexander didn't just send armies, he sent lawyers. Before a single cannon was fired, he executed a massive financial foreclosure. Digging through old Vatican ledgers, the Pope discovered that the lords of Romagna hadn't paid their annual tribute, the census, to the church for generations. He used this breach of contract to declare them insolvent and strip them of their titles legally. To the world, it was a war of conquest. To the Borgias, it was simply collecting on a defaulted debt. This was a world of spectacular corruption, but it was also a world of spectacular culture. Alexander understood that an empire needed a brand, a visual language of invincibility. He reinvested their profits into the greatest artists of the age, commissioning masterpieces that turned the Vatican into a palace of mirrors, reflecting only the glory of the Borgias. They didn't just spend money. They curated an image of divine right that dazzled the eyes of visiting ambassadors and silenced the murmurs of the Roman people. However, being the ultimate shareholders came with a price that gold could not always pay. Every decision was made in a hall of whispers, where trust was the rarest of luxuries. Behind the gilded altars and the soaring frescoes, the air was thick with the scent of secrecy and the metallic tang of hidden daggers. The Borgias were no longer just a family. They were an institution. They had successfully professionalized the papacy, but in doing so, they had made themselves the most scrutinized and most envied targets in Europe. The machinery was in place, the treasury was full, and the children were at their posts. The House of Borgia was no longer rising. It was reigning, and the world was watching for the first sign of a crack in the foundation. By the late 1490s, the House of Borgia had accumulated a treasury that was the envy of every monarch in Europe. But Alexander VI was a man who looked beyond the immediate glimmer of gold coins. He understood that while raw wealth could buy an army, it could not buy a legacy. In the shifting sands of Italian politics, a family of foreign upstarts needed more than just a full vault. They needed to weave their name into the very fabric of history. To do this, they began to reinvest their staggering profits into a campaign of cultural dominance that would make the Borgia brand synonymous with the majesty of God himself. This was not merely a love for beauty. It was a calculated effort to create an aura of invincibility. Alexander began by turning the Vatican's walls into the world's most expensive billboards. He called upon the master Pinturicchio to paint the Borgia apartments, ensuring that every visitor who walked through those halls was surrounded by images that linked the family's destiny to divine providence. By surrounding themselves with the sublime works of Michelangelo and Raphael, the Borgias were engaging in a massive campaign of perception management. They were building a visual barrier to entry for their rivals, signaling that any attack on the Borgias was an attack on the very architects of the Renaissance. While the Pope polished the family's image in Rome, his son Cesare was making an even more radical investment. In a move that displayed a terrifyingly modern foresight, Cesare recruited Leonardo da Vinci as his personal engineer and architect. Cesare wasn't interested in Leonardo's paintings. He wanted his mind. He gave Leonardo total freedom to revolutionize the way war was waged. Leonardo created for Cesare the map of Imola, a masterpiece of cartography that provided a precise, overhead view of the city, a perspective that no other commander in the world possessed. This was the technological moat of the Borgias. While their enemies were still squinting at stylized, inaccurate sketches, Cesare had a god view of the battlefield. He was investing in a future where information and precision were more lethal than 1,000 charging knights. This recruitment was perhaps the most successful executive hire in history, turning the family's wealth into a decisive tactical advantage that left their opponents fighting in the dark. This strategy of cultural armor extended even to the streets of Rome. The Borgias didn't just inhabit the city, they reshaped its infrastructure. By widening the avenues leading to the Vatican and commissioning Donato Bramante to design the iconic Tempietto, they were ensuring that the physical geography of Rome itself bore the Borgia signature. Every stone they laid and every fresco they commissioned was a brick in a fortress of reputation. They were turning their short-term, controversial wealth into eternal capital, something that couldn't be seized by a rival army or annulled by a future pope. Even Lucrezia, in her later years as the Duchess of Ferrara, mastered this art of cultural preservation. She surrounded herself with poets and scholars, effectively laundering the family's blood-stained reputation through the prestige of high culture. She understood that a dynasty is only as strong as the stories told about it. By becoming the most generous patron of her age, she ensured that the Borgia name would survive in the verses of poets long after the family's political grip had crumbled. The Borgias had realized the ultimate truth of power. It is not enough to be rich. You must be inevitable. By bankrolling the high Renaissance, they made themselves a permanent part of the Western soul. They had successfully turned their dirty money into a gilded shield of art and intellect, creating a legend so dazzling that, for a time, it blinded the world to the sins that had paid for it. By the dawn of the 16th century, the House of Borgia appeared to have achieved a level of dominance that was statistically impossible for a family of foreign upstarts. They held the keys to heaven, the most advanced military technology of the age, and a treasury that seemed bottomless. However, as the Borgias reached the zenith of their power, they were unknowingly exposing the fatal flaw in their entire architecture. While their great rivals, the Medici of Florence, had built a blue-chip empire rooted in the lasting institutions of banking and commerce, the Borgias had built something far more volatile, a high-growth startup whose entire valuation depended on the heartbeat of a single man. The fundamental weakness of the Borgia model lay in its lack of institutional permanence. Every territory Cesare conquered, every alliance Lucrezia forged, and every ducat that flowed into the coffers was anchored to the political protection of Alexander VI. In the world of power, this is known as a key man dependency. The Borgias were not building a state that could function without them. They were building a personality cult. While the Medici could lose a patriarch and still have their bank branches and credit networks across Europe to sustain them, the Borgias had no such foundation. Their collateral was not gold or land, it was the Pope's life. This lack of institutional depth meant that the Borgia stock was essentially tied to a single life. In the world of high-stakes power, they were an over-leveraged startup with no backup capital, waiting for a single heartbeat to fail. In August 1503, the Black Swan event that the Borgias had never truly prepared for finally arrived. As the sweltering Roman summer brought with it the deadly Roman fever, both Alexander VI and Cesare fell violently ill. In a chilling twist of fate, the CEO and the COO of the Borgia enterprise were incapacitated at the exact same moment. While a traditional kingdom would have a clear line of succession, the papacy was an elected office. The moment Alexander's pulse slowed, the family's contracts with the rest of the world began to dissolve. Mercenary captains who had sworn loyalty to the Borgia gold suddenly realized that the paymaster might not survive the week. When Alexander VI finally breathed his last on August 18th, the Borgia Empire suffered a total systemic collapse. It was the Renaissance equivalent of a sudden market crash, because they had reinvested almost all their liquid wealth into the soft power of art and the fixed assets of war. They lacked the ready cash to defend themselves once the papal treasury was locked away by the College of Cardinals. Cesare, still shivering from fever in his bed, watched as his portfolio of cities in the Romagna vanished almost overnight. Without the legal and financial shield of the papacy, the Borgias were no longer a sovereign power. They were merely a family of wealthy refugees. The rapid liquidation of their assets was brutal. Their rivals, led by the fierce Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere, the man who would become Pope Julius II, moved in to short the Borgia legacy. Julius II did not just take their lands. He attempted to erase their brand entirely. He moved out of the Borgia apartment, refusing to look at the frescoes Alexander had commissioned, and declared that the very name Borgia should be struck from the records of the church. The family that had spent a decade trying to become inevitable found out that in the absence of a lasting institution, memory can be as fragile as glass. The Borgias' story ends not with a whimper, but with a profound lesson in the nature of legacy. They proved that you can buy the most brilliant minds, win the most spectacular battles, and accumulate the greatest wealth. But if you do not build a system that can outlive the individual, you are merely renting power from history. The Medici survived for centuries because they owned the bank. The Borgias vanished in a generation because they only owned the throne. Yet, there is a final irony in their post-crash history. Decades after the family's political fall, a great-grandson of Alexander VI, Francis Borgia, would walk away from the remnants of the family's titles to lead the Jesuit order. But what drove a Borgia to such extreme holiness? It was a moment of Gothic horror. Tasked with escorting the corpse of the beautiful Empress Isabella, Francis was forced to open her coffin, struck by the sight of her rotting face. He realized the futility of worldly power. He vowed, "Never again will I serve a master that can die." This psychological pivot turned the grandson of a murderer into a saint. He realized that the only investment worth making was one that didn't depend on the whims of kings or the breath of popes. The dynasty that began with an aggressive thirst for the world ended with a saint who gave it all away. The House of Borgia left behind a warning that still echoes. The most dangerous thing about absolute power is not how you gain it, but how quickly it disappears when the man at the center finally steps out of the light. The bankruptcy of 1503 was not written in the stars, but in the blood spilled on the streets of Rome years earlier. Before the empire could crumble from the outside, it first began to devour itself from within. The clock of the Borgia downfall started ticking, not at the Pope's deathbed, but in June 1497, with a disappearance that changed everything. Chapter 3. The Hostile Takeover, the Fall of the Sword. In the golden twilight of 1497, the House of Borgia appeared invincible. Pope Alexander VI had achieved the impossible. He had turned the papacy into a family-run empire. But every empire, no matter how vast its treasury, has a single point of failure. For the Borgias, that failure was the fragile line between life and death. Alexander had placed his greatest bet on his favorite son, Juan Borgia, naming him the commander of the papal armies. Juan was meant to be the sword of the family, the one who would physically carve out a kingdom in the heart of Italy. But on a humid June night, the sword was broken. Juan vanished into the labyrinth of Rome's dark alleys after a final, wine-soaked dinner with his family. When his body was finally pulled from the black waters of the Tiber 3 days later, the sight was a message written in blood. He had been stabbed 9 times, his throat slit, and his ceremonial ring finger, the finger that represented his rank and future, had been brutally severed. The assassins hadn't touched the 30 gold ducats in his purse. This wasn't a robbery. It was a cold, professional liquidation of the family's most important military asset. The news hit the Vatican like a financial collapse. Alexander VI, the man who had outmaneuvered kings and bought cardinals, was reduced to a father screaming in agony. His cries echoing through the marble halls, he realized, with a terrifying clarity, that he had invested everything in a vessel that could be emptied by a single dagger. Juan's death wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a catastrophic loss of the family's secular power. The armies were suddenly leaderless. The strategic territories they had seized were now vulnerable. and the carefully woven web of alliances began to fray as the world realized the Borgias were mortal. In the days that followed, a second, even darker realization began to dawn on the Pope. While rumors in the streets whispered Cesare's name, the brilliant but neglected brother who had been forced into the church while Juan was given the glory of the battlefield, modern historians point to a different culprit, the Orsini clan, vengeful after recent military losses. Yet, in the theater of power, the identity of the assassin was secondary to the survival of the firm. Alexander VI faced an impossible choice: seek justice for his dead son and risk destroying the only executive he had left, or swallow his grief to keep the dynasty alive. Ultimately, the Pope closed the investigation, realizing that exposing the truth, whether it led to a rival family or his own blood, would trigger a systemic collapse. He chose to protect the empire over the individual, bearing the truth alongside Juan to ensure the Borgia engine kept running. Alexander VI chose the empire. He closed the investigation, silenced the witnesses, and buried the truth alongside Juan. But in doing so, he acknowledged that the price of the Borgia legacy was the blood of its own. The liquidation of Juan Borgia had left a vacancy that only one man could fill, a man who had just proven he was willing to do anything to seize the reins of power. The era of Juan, the favored son, was over. The reign of Cesare, the wolf in scarlet, had begun. The death of Juan Borgia left a silence in the Vatican that was louder than any funeral dirge. For Pope Alexander VI, the loss was not just the death of a son. It was the sudden, violent shattering of a grand design. He had built his world on two pillars, one of the spirit and one of the sword, with Juan's body pulled from the mud of the Tiber. The pillar of the sword had crumbled. The house of Borgia was now a kingdom with a crown, but no one to defend it. A fortress with its gates wide open to the wolves of Rome. In the days following the burial, Alexander sat in the darkness of his private chambers, the weight of the papacy pressing down on him like a leaden shroud. He looked at his remaining son, Cesare, who stood in the shadows wearing the scarlet robes of a cardinal. These robes, meant to symbolize the blood of Christ, now felt like a cage to the young man. Cesare's eyes didn't hold the light of a priest. They held the cold, sharp glint of a soldier. The Pope realized that to save the family's future, he would have to perform a miracle of a different kind. He would have to turn a prince of the church into a prince of war. This was a move that Rome had never seen, and one that the laws of God supposedly forbade. A cardinal did not simply walk away from the altar to pick up a blade. But for the Borgias, the rules of heaven were always negotiable when the survival of the dynasty was at stake. Alexander began a desperate, high-stakes game of influence. He turned to the King of France, offering the church's most sacred blessings and political favors in exchange for a single thing: a new life for Cesare. He bought his son a title, the Dukedom of Valentinois, and with it, a path to the battlefields Cesare had always craved. The day Cesare walked into the consistory and laid his red hat at the feet of the horrified cardinals was the day the Borgia corporate strategy pivoted forever. It was a moment of profound sacrifice. By moving Cesare from the church to the military, Alexander was essentially emptying one vault to fill another. He was stripping the family of its long-term influence within the halls of the Vatican to gain the immediate, brutal strength of a commander. The spiritual capital they had spent decades building was being liquidated to pay for the steel, the horses, and the cannons that Cesare would soon lead across Italy. This forced restructuring came with a heavy price tag. The French alliance cost the Borgias dearly in territory and prestige, and the scandal of a cardinal resigning his post left a permanent stain on the family name. But as Cesare traded his silk robes for Milanese armor, the message to the world was clear. The House of Borgia would not mourn in silence. However, moving from the altar to the battlefield required more than just a change of wardrobe. It required a massive infusion of liquidity. To fund this hostile takeover of the Romagna, Cesare didn't just rely on the Bank of Dad. He leveraged foreign capital, securing a loan of 45,000 ducats from King Louis XII of France, essentially venture debt, to finance his startup kingdom. He was borrowing against the future earnings of territories he hadn't even conquered yet, proving he understood the power of leverage better than any prince of his time. They had lost a general, but they had gained a wolf. The vacancy left by Juan was gone, replaced by a darker, more efficient power. The Borgias had decided that if they could not be loved as saints, they would be feared as masters, no matter how many sacred vows they had to burn to keep the flame of their ambition alive. If the death of Juan Borgia was the spark that threatened to burn down the Borgia Empire, Cesare's response was the cold, calculated move of a man who had been waiting for the fire. For years, Cesare had lived in the shadow of his brother's military glory, confined to the red robes of a cardinal, a role that gave him immense spiritual influence, but zero command over the iron and horses he craved. In the silent, blood-stained wake of Juan's murder, the world began to realize that the House of Borgia was no longer a partnership of brothers. It had become a monarchy of one. History has never been able to prove, beyond a shadow of doubt, that Cesare was the one who plunged the knife into Juan, but in the theater of power, proof is often less important than results. Within weeks of the murder, the investigation was not just stalled, it was buried. The messengers who brought names of suspects to the Pope were silenced. The internal audit of the family's greatest tragedy was shut down by Alexander VI himself. This silence was the ultimate admission of a hostile takeover. The Pope understood that if he lost Cesare to the law, the Borgia dynasty would lose its only remaining engine of survival. Cesare had played a high-stakes game. He had removed his only rival for the family's secular throne, leaving his father with no choice but to back the survivor. This was a takeover of the family's hard assets. All the titles, the lands, and the military commands that had belonged to Juan did not return to the church. They flowed directly to Cesare. By eliminating Juan, Cesare had effectively consolidated the family's portfolio. No longer would the Borgia resources be split between a commander in the field and a cardinal in the Vatican. Now, the money from the papal treasury, the diplomatic weight of the papacy, and the brutal efficiency of the mercenary armies were all concentrated in one hand. Cesare became the sole managing partner of the Borgia enterprise, and his first act was to purge the organization of anyone who still whispered Juan's name. The brilliance and the horror of this takeover lay in its total lack of sentimentality. Cesare didn't just step into Juan's boots, he redesigned them. He moved with a speed and a cold-bloodedness that Juan never possessed. He transformed the papal army from a ceremonial guard into a professional killing machine. He hired the best engineers, bought the heaviest cannons, and executed his enemies with a theatrical flair that made the very name Borgia a synonym for inevitable doom. This was the new management style of the Renaissance: efficient, terrifying, and utterly devoid of the traditional rules of chivalry or brotherhood. The internal hostile takeover was complete when Cesare stood before the world, not as a grieving brother, but as the Duke of Valentinois. He had traded the scarlet of a martyr for the black and gold of a conqueror. The cost of this succession was the life of his own blood, but in Cesare's mind, that was merely the price of doing business in a world where only the strongest survive. The House of Borgia had pivoted from a fragile family alliance into a centralized powerhouse. But as Cesare looked out over the lands he was about to conquer, he knew that the shadow of Juan's ghost would always follow him. He had won the takeover, but he had also ensured that from that day forward, no one, not even his father, could ever truly trust him again. The empire was now a lonely fortress, held together by fear rather than love. A business built on a foundation of fratricide. With the internal hierarchy now settled in blood, Cesare Borgia emerged as the family's sole commander, but he soon faced a cold, logistical reality. Grand armies and Leonardo's inventions required an infinite stream of gold. To keep the Borgia engine running, they would need to move beyond the blunt force of the sword and embrace a far more efficient and far more silent method of asset acquisition. Chapter 4. Surgical Asset Recovery. The chemistry of death. By the year 1500, the House of Borgia had reached a critical threshold. Cesare Borgia's relentless campaigns across the Romagna were breathtaking in their speed, but they carried a staggering overhead. Siege engines, thousands of mercenaries, and the sophisticated fortifications designed by Leonardo da Vinci required a constant, massive influx of gold. The traditional streams of papal income, tithes, and the sale of offices were no longer sufficient to fuel the family's accelerating expansion. To maintain their momentum, The Borgias needed a way to unlock the vast, stagnant wealth held by the ancient aristocratic families of Rome. The Borgias realized that the most expensive part of growth was the overhead of war. To solve this, they shifted their strategy from hostile military takeover to surgical asset recovery, using the chemistry of the vial to clear the ledger of their most stubborn creditors. This was the moment when a legendary substance known as canarella entered the family's strategic toolkit. Unlike a sword, which required an army and a public battlefield, this colorless, tasteless distillation allowed for a surgical removal of obstacles. In the quiet corners of the Apostolic Palace, the Borgias discovered that a single drop in a glass of Malvasia wine could achieve what months of warfare could not: the immediate transfer of an enemy's entire estate into the hands of the church. The most prominent example of this hostile takeover was the case of the Orsini family. The Orsini were not just rivals, they were a roadblock. They controlled vital fortresses and lucrative toll routes that sat directly in the path of Cesare's ambitions. More importantly, they held vast liquid assets that the Pope desperately needed to fund his son's next move. In December 1502, Cardinal Giovanni Battista Orsini was invited to dine at the Pope's table. He arrived as a powerful, independent lord. He left with a fever that no physician could cure. As the cardinal's health rapidly declined over the following weeks, the Borgia apparatus was already moving with practiced efficiency. There was no need for a trial or a public seizure. According to the laws of the era, the property of high-ranking church officials who died without heirs reverted to the papacy. By the time Orsini drew his final breath, his fortresses had already been occupied, his treasury counted, and his lands integrated into the Borgia domain. It was a masterpiece of efficiency, a total absorption of a competitor's value at the cost of a single dinner. Throughout Alexander VI's reign, this pattern repeated with chilling regularity. Influential figures who stood in the way of the family's growth, whether they were stubborn bankers or wealthy cardinals, frequently succumbed to sudden illnesses just as the papal treasury faced a deficit. These deaths were never chaotic. They were followed by an orderly, legalistic transfer of assets that seemed almost choreographed. The Borgias had realized that in the game of absolute power, the most effective way to balance the books was to ensure that your rivals simply ceased to exist. This clandestine system turned the Vatican into a high-stakes arena where an invitation to lunch carried as much risk as a declaration of war. By treating the lives of their enemies as obstacles to be cleared from the ledger, the Borgias created a new, terrifying model of governance. They proved that a dynasty could grow faster through the chemistry of the vial than through the steel of the legion, provided they could keep the true nature of their seizures hidden behind the veil of natural causes. But Cesare didn't just use poison. He used psychology. His masterpiece was not a battle, but a dinner party at Senegalia. He lured his rebellious generals with promises of reconciliation, a move Machiavelli called il bellissimo inganno, the beautiful deception. He greeted them with hugs, separated them from their troops, and had them strangled before dessert. He proved that in the Borgia business model, a smile was far more lethal than a cannon. In the world of absolute power, efficiency often comes with a hidden cost. While the Borgias' use of silent liquidation allowed them to acquire vast territories and refill their coffers with unparalleled speed, it simultaneously created a massive reputation debt. In modern terms, they were sacrificing their long-term brand equity for short-term liquidity. By 1502, the name Borgia had become so synonymous with the vial and the dagger that it created a trust deficit across Europe. This wasn't just a moral problem. It was a profound operational risk. The greatest risk of a strategy built on fear and concealment is that it eventually alienates all potential partners. As more cardinals and bankers met, sudden, convenient ends. The cost of doing business with the Vatican soared. Strategic allies who should have been stabilizing the Borgia Empire began to hedge their bets. Ambassadors from Venice, Florence, and Spain began to include poison clauses in their private thoughts. Refusing to eat at the Pope's table or attend intimate summits unless they brought their own food tasters. The Borgias had successfully optimized their income, but they had decimated their social capital, making it impossible to build the stable, multi-generational institutional alliances that a family like the Medici excelled at. This toxic brand also triggered a violent reaction from the public. While the Borgias controlled the official ledgers, they could not control the underground market of information. The newly invented printing press became a weapon used against them, churning out pamphlets that depicted Alexander VI not as a holy leader, but as a pharmacist of death. These early versions of a viral smear campaign were more damaging than any army. They created a narrative of depravity that was so powerful, it eventually became the Black Legend, a historical stain that effectively canceled the family's legitimacy for centuries. The ultimate operational failure, however, occurred in August 1503. The system they had created, one built on absolute secrecy and the concentration of power in two men, had no redundancy. When Alexander and Cesare both fell ill after a dinner at a cardinal's villa, the entire Borgia apparatus froze. Legend says they drank their own poison in a poetic twist of fate. However, modern forensic history points to a killer more prolific than any Borgia. The mosquito. It was likely Plasmodium falciparum, deadly malaria, that claimed the Pope, not Cantarella. Ironically, nature did what their enemies could not. Because the family had replaced trusted advisors with fearful subordinates, there was no one to manage the crisis while the leaders were incapacitated. When Alexander VI died, the reputation debt was called in immediately. The family found that they had no friends left to bail them out. Their enemies didn't just seize their lands. They moved to liquidate the Borgia name entirely. The successor to the throne, Julius II, realized that to restore the market value of the papacy, he had to aggressively distance the institution from the Borgia methods. He declared their apartments cursed, their treaties void, and their memory anathema. The Borgias had lived by the ledger of the vial, and in the end, they were erased by the very pens they once used to seize the world. They proved that in the business of history, a fortune built on the destruction of trust is a fortune that can never be sustained. The Borgia poisoning ring serves as one of history's most chilling lessons in the sustainability trap. On paper, their strategy was a masterstroke of high-margin acquisition. They discovered a way to remove the overhead of war, the costly sieges, the unreliable mercenaries, and the months of logistical strain, and replace it with a low-cost, high-return chemical solution. But in the cold calculus of long-term power, they forgot a fundamental law. Absolute efficiency at the expense of trust is a self-liquidating strategy. In any sustainable enterprise, whether a modern corporation or a Renaissance dynasty, the most valuable asset is not gold or land, but credibility. Credibility is the social currency that allows a leader to borrow time, forge alliances, and survive a crisis. By turning the dinner table into a battlefield, the Borgias didn't just kill their rivals, they poisoned their own market. They created a world where no contract was sacred and no alliance was safe. When you operate a system where every partner is a potential victim, you ensure that the moment you stumble, the entire market will move to short your existence. The ultimate failure of the model was its inability to transition from predatory acquisition to institutional stability. They were experts at seizing value, but amateurs at preserving it. Because their wealth was built on the wreckage of others, rather than the growth of a stable system, it possessed no structural integrity. The moment the key man, Alexander VI, was removed from the equation, the family had no institutional allies to catch their fall. They had spent their reputation capital so recklessly that they were left with a negative net worth in the eyes of history. Ultimately, the Borgias proved that a dynasty built on the vial is as fragile as the glass that holds it. They left behind a legacy that serves as a stark warning to any power seeker. Wealth acquired through the destruction of trust carries a hidden interest rate that eventually bankrupts the soul. The Borgia bull may have roared across Italy for a decade, but it was silenced forever by a ledger that simply refused to balance blood with lasting authority. The silent efficiency of the vial had allowed the Borgias to liquidate their rivals and consolidate a staggering amount of short-term capital. But as any titan of industry knows, acquiring wealth is only half the battle. The true test of a dynasty lies in its ability to protect its most valuable strategic assets and transmit power to the next generation. While Alexander VI had successfully positioned his children at the helm of the church and the army, the House of Borgia was now facing a looming internal crisis. To understand the ultimate fragility of their empire, we must look past the battlefield and into the private chambers of the Vatican, where a hidden liability threatened to bankrupt the family's diplomatic credit before their most important merger could ever be signed. Chapter 5. Toxic Assets, the Price of a Political Merger. By the late 1490s, the House of Borgia was engaged in an aggressive period of portfolio restructuring. Pope Alexander VI had realized that his initial alliance with the Sforza family of Milan, sealed through the marriage of his daughter, Lucrezia, to Giovanni Sforza, was no longer yielding the political returns he required. In the rapidly shifting market of Italian power, the Sforzas had become a stagnant investment. To propel his son Cesare's ambitions further, Alexander needed to relist Lucrezia on the marriage market. Seeking a more powerful merger with the royalty of Naples or the prestige of the House of Este, in 1497, the Vatican moved to officially liquidate the Sforza contract. The legal mechanism chosen was an annulment based on the claim that the marriage had never been consummated. To the public, it was a sensational scandal. To the Borgias, it was a necessary write-off to clear the path for a more lucrative deal. But as the legal gears began to grind, a terrifying complication emerged from the shadows of the private apartments. Rumors began to swirl that the 17-year-old Lucrezia was carrying a secret, a pregnancy that, if discovered, would render the entire annulment a legal fiction and destroy her market value forever. In the high-stakes game of Renaissance diplomacy, Lucrezia's body was the family's most valuable diplomatic instrument. Her purity was the collateral for the next great alliance. An unplanned child at this moment was not a personal tragedy. It was a catastrophic, unaccounted liability that could lead to a total loss of trust with future partners. If the world saw a swell beneath her silken gowns, the Borgia brand would be exposed as fraudulent, and the family would lose their leverage, just as they were preparing to claim all of central Italy. As the spring of 1497 progressed, the atmosphere inside the Vatican became thick with a desperate, guarded energy. Foreign envoys, the corporate spies of their day, began to note telltale signs of a hidden deficit. Lucrezia, once the vibrant center of Roman social life, began to retreat into the depths of the palace. When she did appear, her attire had changed. The tight, form-fitting bodices of the previous season were replaced by heavy, layered gowns and broad velvet cloaks that fell awkwardly across her middle. Her complexion, usually radiant, was now masked by thick layers of white lead powder to hide a persistent, sickly pallor. Behind the closed doors of the Borgia apartments, the maintenance costs of this secret were rising. Chamberlains were dispatched on urgent, midnight errands to apothecaries tucked away in the labyrinthine streets near Campo dei Fiori. They returned with satchels containing bitter-smelling herbs, costmary, rue, and artemisia. These were not the ingredients for a common tonic. They were the tools used to clear a ledger of an unwanted heartbeat. The Pope's own confessor, a man accustomed to the darkest of human secrets, whispered to his diaries of a sorrow thick as velvet that seemed to permeate the very stones of the palace. The speculation in the taverns and courts of Europe branched into three dangerous directions, each more damaging to the Borgia reputation than the last. Some suspected a fleeting affair with a handsome courier named Perotto, a minor operational lapse. Others, led by the bitter Giovanni Sforza, accused the Pope of manufacturing the annulment to hide a much darker, incestuous secret within the family crest. In the cold logic of the Borgia regime, the identity of the fathers was a secondary concern. The primary objective was the total erasure of the evidence. If the pregnancy reached maturity, the Borgia succession plan would be effectively canceled by the court of public opinion. Alexander and Cesare understood that in the business of absolute power, a scandal only exists if it can be proven. To protect their future mergers, they had to ensure that Lucrezia remained a clean asset in the eyes of the world. They began a campaign of strategic silence and misdirection, preparing to settle this liability in the dead of night. They proved that the most effective way to manage a catastrophic risk is to ensure that the truth never officially makes it onto the balance sheet. For Lucrezia, the cost of her family's survival was the forced disappearance of her own reality. As she became a ghost within her own skin, to satisfy the relentless demands of the Borgia bull. As a suffocating silence descended over the long corridors of the Apostolic Palace, the Borgia family's risk mitigation strategy moved into its active phase. In the world of Alexander VI, every problem had a price, and every liability could be liquidated if one possessed enough gold and sufficient ruthlessness to preserve the merger agreement with the royal house of Naples and keep Lucrezia's public profile untarnished. The family was forced to execute the most silent and desperate audit in their history under the absolute cover of night. A friar, who doubled as a master of clandestine pharmacology, was escorted through the narrow servants' passages. He carried a leather satchel filled with high-potency remedies, Artemisia, absinthium, and juniper, substances known not for healing the living, but for settling an inconvenient heartbeat. In the family's internal ledgers, this man was never named. He was merely a subcontractor, hired to fix a catastrophic breach in the dynasty's strategic defenses. Inside the shuttered bedchamber, Lucrezia lay as a prisoner of her own lineage. The flickering oil lamp cast shadows across the walls where Borgia tapestries, symbols of the family's market dominance, now stood as silent witnesses to a grim necessity. The most trusted servants were sworn to absolute silence, their suppressed sobs muffled by the heavy velvet drapes. The friar's prayers, drifted upward in a low hum, were directed toward a god who, to the Borgias, was both a judge and a business partner who could be bargained with through golden penance. This operation bore all the hallmarks of a forced asset liquidation. To secure the physician's skill and silence, Alexander VI provided a heavy purse of florins and a pre-drafted decree of absolute absolution for the Pope. This was a necessary operational expense. He was performing a cold, moral calculus. The life of an unacknowledged heir weighed against the survival of a global empire. If this procedure failed and Lucrezia died, the family's primary diplomatic capital would evaporate. But if it succeeded, the shadow debt would be wiped clean, and Lucrezia would once again become a net asset with high value in the European marriage market. Hours passed in agonizing tension, the sharp, acrid scent of salt crackling on hot coals desperately attempted to mask the metallic tang of blood that permeated the small room. This was the moment where absolute power met the fragility of human existence. As the dawn began to stain the Tiber crimson, the physician slipped away through the back gates, his cloakum bearing the evidence of a secret successfully buried. A corresponding entry in the Vatican household accounts for that week was discreetly, permanently blotted out. A primitive but effective act of shredding the evidence before history could record the default. The following morning, Alexander VI executed a masterful piece of public relations. He announced a massive charitable fund for the dowries of dozens of poor Roman brides. The loud, celebratory ringing of silver ducats falling into the charity chests successfully drowned out the whispers regarding Lucrezia's sudden illness. It was a classic diversionary tactic, using a flamboyant act of philanthropy to cover a moral write-off performed in the dark. When Lucrezia reappeared on the palace balcony days later, her waist slender and her expression an icy mask of grace, the diplomatic world understood that the Borgia brand had been successfully restructured. To the envoys of Ferrara and Naples, her portfolio once again appeared flawless. The Borgias had proven that, in the business of power, the truth is secondary to the ability to control the narrative. They had liquidated a potential liability to secure the future of the firm, leaving the true cost, the psychological scarring of a young woman, entirely off the public balance sheet. By the turn of the century, the House of Borgia had successfully executed one of the most difficult brand pivots in Renaissance history. The clandestine liquidation of 1497 was now a buried secret, and Lucrezia Borgia was once again the most coveted diplomatic asset in Italy. However, the Borgias knew that her market value was still fragile. The whispers of the past were like a dormant virus that could resurface at any moment. To ensure a permanent return on their investment, they needed to move Lucrezia from the volatile Roman market to a blue-chip institution, the ancient and prestigious Duchy of Ferrara. The target was the House of Este, a dynasty so established and respected that a merger with them would act as a legitimacy shield for the Borgia name. But the Este family were savvy investors. They were well aware of the toxic assets associated with Lucrezia's past. To overcome their resistance, Alexander VI and Caesare had to offer a sweetener so massive it could not be refused. They weren't just offering a bride, they were offering a colossal capital injection of 100,000 null ducats in cash, plus the cession of valuable territories, and a significant reduction in the annual taxes Ferrara owed to the papacy. This was rebranding on a grand scale. To prepare Lucrezia for her new role as the Duchess of Ferrara, the Borgias invested heavily in her public image. She was surrounded by poets, scholars, and musicians, transforming her from a scandal-ridden pawn into a sophisticated patron of the arts. She became the face of the new, refined Borgia era. Every public appearance was choreographed to display grace, piety, and an almost icy composure. The goal was to prove that the liability of 1497 had been completely amortized, leaving only a polished, sovereign figure fit to lead one of Europe's oldest courts. The merger was finalized in 1502. Lucrezia's journey from Rome to Ferrara was a marketing roadshow of unprecedented scale. A convoy of nearly 1,000 people, including hundreds of horses and wagons, filled with her staggering dowry, moved slowly across Italy. It was a display of financial might, designed to silence any remaining skeptics. When she finally entered Ferrara, she didn't enter as a refugee of a scandal, but as a queen bringing a fortune. The House of Este accepted the deal, realizing that the liquidity she brought outweighed the reputational risk of her history. Once settled in Ferrara, Lucrezia performed a final, brilliant strategic move. She diversified her interests. She moved away from the volatile politics of her father and brother and invested herself in the local community. She established hospitals, reformed the education of midwives, and became a beloved figure of mercy. In modern terms, she was building social capital. While the men played war, Lucrezia was playing the long game of asset appreciation. In Ferrara, she didn't just spend money, she multiplied it. Lucrezia used her personal funds to buy cheap, useless marshland. She then invested in massive drainage projects, land reclamation, transforming swamps into prime agricultural real estate. Instead of selling, she rented the land out, doubling her annual income. She was the first Borgia to understand that true wealth comes from value-add investing, not just conquest. By the time her father died in 1503 and the Borgia Empire collapsed in Rome, Lucrezia remained untouched. Her assets were now safely sheltered within the House of Este, far beyond the reach of the auditors who moved to dismantle her family's legacy. She proved that while men build empires with cannons and gold, a woman's greatest weapon is her ability to outlast the scandals that seek to define her. Lucrezia had successfully secured her permanent exit, but this stability was a luxury her father could never afford. While his daughter was busy laundering the family name through the prestige of Ferrara, Pope Alexander VI remained in the heart of the storm, focused on the primary engine that powered their every move, the relentless, industrial-scale acquisition of capital. To understand how the Borgias funded their wars, their arts, and their survival, we must look past the altars of the Vatican and into the cold, calculated mechanics of the papal treasury. Chapter 6. Monetizing Salvation. The industrial-scale grift. Close your eyes and step into a private quarter of the Vatican late at night. The marble floor beneath you is veined like old, weathered parchment, reflecting the restless gold of torches flickering against tapestries as thick as winter cloaks. Beyond a massive oak door, iron-banded and shut tight against the nocturnal hum of Rome, Pope Alexander VI sits awake at a walnut writing table. To the casual observer, this is a scene of prayer or quiet administration. To those who understand the true mechanics of the Renaissance, it is the center of the most audacious initial public offering in history. The candle on the Pope's table sputters, wax running like molten coin down the silver branch of a heavy candelabrum. Spread before him on the green felt are two disparate objects that define the Borgia era. The first is a blank parchment bowl, waiting to be inscribed and sealed with the lead disc that will officially raise a man to the College of Cardinals. The second is a cedar coffer, its lid slightly ajar, brimming with gold ducats, polished as bright as a Tuscan sunrise. In a few deliberate strokes of his quill, the Pope will trade the spiritual authority inherent in the first for the hard, temporal power represented by the second. At this desk, The spiritual geography of Europe is being tilted, slightly, but irrevocably, toward the burgeoning empire of the House of Borgia. There is no celestial thunder at this exchange. No distant choirs gasp in horror. There is only the soft, dry rasp of the pen on vellum, betraying the fact that one of heaven's highest offices is being traded like a parcel of desirable land near the Tiber. The tariff for tonight's halo is precise: 52,000 ducats delivered up front, counted by wary clerks in a side room, accompanied by a gentleman's promise that the newly minted cardinal's powerful family will float substantial loans whenever His Holiness requires them. Rodrigo Borgia, master statesman, canon lawyer, and father of four, has become the ultimate broker of salvation, and under his hand, salvation has a precise, fluctuating market rate. This scene, repeated in variations across 11 brisk and profitable years, powered the Borgia machine. While Alexander maintained the outward pageantry of the papacy, he was essentially running a high-stakes equity fund where the buy-in was a scarlet hat. Historians often call this simony, the sin of selling the holy. But in the cold light of the 15th century, it was a vital capital-raising strategy. Sometimes the fee arrived in leather sacks, stamped with the guild marks of Spanish monarchs. Other times, the wealth was disguised in Florentine bills of exchange or concealed in velvet pouches containing sapphires and emeralds meant to ease customs inspection. The official ledgers meticulously dressed each payment in pious euphemism, donum devotionis, a gift of devotion. Yet the palace whispers knew the cold truth. Every ducat was reinvested into the Borgia clan's primary ventures: Caesare's lightning wars in the Romagna, Lucrezia's dazzling, politically calculated dowries, and street festivals grand enough to silence Roman unrest. All of it burned fuel, scooped directly from these midnight coffers. Chroniclers of the day tried, mouths half open in disbelief, to tally the dizzying total: 2 million ducats, perhaps 3. In a world where a master stonemason supporting a family earned a mere 40 ducats a year, these figures were mythic, bordering on fiction. In the cold ledgers of history, these 2 to 3 million gold ducats represent a staggering concentration of wealth. To view this through a modern lens, we are looking at an empire with a valuation of roughly $200 million, a fortune built not on industry, but on the monetization of the divine. Alexander did not invent this corrupt game, but he simplified it, professionalized it, and raised the stakes until earlier betrayals of principle looked like amateurish, provincial deals. To watch Alexander play required rewinding to the conclave of 1492. He secured his own election not through prayer, but through a masterclass in lobbying. His supporters fanned through the Sistine Chapel, promising key posts, magnificent palaces, and fortified strongholds to cardinals wavering between factions. One ally collected the lucrative office of vice-chancellor plus 4 Umbrian castles as a signing bonus. Another accepted a magnificent palazzo on the Tiber. These payments were merely the down payments on a portfolio that would soon dwarf every previous papal patronage scheme. Between 1493 and 1503, Alexander created 43 cardinals, nearly 4 a year. He understood that the red hat was a limited resource, and like any savvy operator, he maximized its value. Every nomination was a fresh outpouring of cash or credit. Even holy war became a revenue stream. Spanish sovereigns Isabella and Ferdinand petitioned for names in their own court. But Alexander obliged only after channeling Spanish financing through carefully constructed Borgia accounts. He had successfully turned the church into a primary market where the currency was faith. But the dividends were strictly gold and steel. If the sale of cardinal seats was the primary market for the elite, then the indulgence trade was the Borgia's retail division, designed to capture the wealth of the common man. These parchment slips, promises that time spent in purgatory could be shortened by a pious donation, had existed for centuries. But under Alexander VI, they assumed an industrial scale and a terrifying commercial polish. The Pope understood that while there were only a few dozen families rich enough to buy a red hat, there were millions of peasants across Europe willing to part with their last silver coin to buy peace for their souls. Alexander transformed the clergy into a sophisticated sales force. Trained preachers, polished in rhetoric and psychological persuasion, swept across the continent like modern-day consultants. They announced limited-time offers, fund a new hospital wing in Rome, or a crusade in the East, and spare yourself a millennium of post-mortem flame. The faithful queued in the naves of cathedrals from Lisbon to Lubeck, their fear of the afterlife expertly monetized. The fees were meticulously tiered: 1 ducat to ease a petty sin, 6 for an act of violence, and a premium rate for illuminated lettering fit for framing. The logistical precision of this operation was breathtaking. In Roman counting rooms, Borgia accountants sat behind heavy oak tables, bundling the clattering take of the day. These spiritual dividends were rarely spent on prayer. Instead, the scribes traced their echo in solid bronze: 40 siege cannons forged in Bologna, 400 horses shod for the mud of the Romagna, and wagons of lamp-black powder rumbling up the Via Flaminia. Venetian envoys, masters of cold observation, reported with dry understatement that the Borgia armies marched by the grace of God and the gold of Rome. Niccolò Machiavelli, whose wit cut deeper than any dagger, observed that the Pope had discovered a tax more obedient than any state levied duty on salt or grain. It was a tax on the conscience, a revenue stream that required no border guards to collect. However, such a massive extraction of wealth seldom stays a secret for long. In Florence, the Dominican preacher, Girolamo Savonarola, became the first major whistleblower of the Borgia machine. From the pulpit of Santa Maria del Fiore, his face lantern lit above a sea of anxious faces, he denounced what he called the golden harlot of Rome. Savonarola didn't need to see the secret ledgers. He could smell the corruption in the swirl of newly minted cardinals and the stories of midnight feasts glowing with silver plate. His famous bonfires of the vanities consumed mirrors, perfumes, and playing cards, but his fiercest flames were aimed at Alexander's distant throne. For a moment, it seemed that a single monk might trigger a run on the bank of the papacy. Rome's response was a masterclass in crisis management. Alexander did not engage in a theological debate. He used the levers of institutional power to protect his cash flow. He first issued an interdict, a spiritual strike, and then a swift excommunication. Within a year, bending to the economic pressure of the Pope's sanctions, the Florentine magistrates turned on their own prophet. Savonarola was hanged and his body burned in the Piazza della Signoria. The resulting smoke carried a plain lesson across the continent. Theology may argue with Rome, but any attack on the papal cash pipeline invites total ruin. Back inside the Vatican, the machine hummed onward, unbothered by the charred remains of the preacher. The ledgers titled Preventus Camerae, Income of the Papal Chamber, spiked dramatically during the Jubilee year of 1500. This was the fiscal peak of Alexander's reign. He ordered 6 temporary bridges built across the Tiber so that 500,000 pilgrims could reach St. Peter's without clogging vital trade routes. To the pilgrims, these bridges were a path to salvation. To Alexander, they were toll booths to the divine. The humanist Paolo Cortesi remarked sharply that the Pope opens the gates of paradise, yet keeps the toll booth in his own vestibule. By 1502, the Borgias had effectively privatized the afterlife. They had turned sanctity into a negotiable security and the church into a holding company for their dynastic ambitions. But as any modern investor knows, when a system becomes too aggressive in its extraction, it begins to hollow out its own foundation. The industrial greed of the Borgia years was creating a bad debt of resentment across Germany and Northern Europe, a debt that would eventually be called in by a monk named Martin Luther, leading to the greatest systemic collapse in the history of the Western Church. As the year 1502 drew to a close, the Borgia financial engine was running at a terrifying speed. But like any market bubble, the higher the growth, the more fragile the foundation. Caesare's appetite for artillery and mercenaries was outstripping even the industrial-scale income of the indulgence mill. Rodrigo, ever the resourceful chairman, began to explore even more aggressive financial derivatives. He started selling years of future church taxes to Genoese and Venetian bankers at a steep discount, creating a Renaissance version of treasury bills to secure immediate liquidity. He was, in effect, mortgaging the future of the papacy to pay for the wars of the present. However, no fountain of gold runs without end. In the northern territories, particularly in Germany, the constant extraction of wealth was reaching a breaking point. Parish priests in Cologne and Mainz watched as their congregations pawned their last household pans to buy the Borgia remission slips. One German clergyman wrote wearily that the people strain their purses, yet depart uneasy, for guilt renewed is never silent. The Borgias had successfully optimized their short-term revenue, but they were creating a long-term liability of resentment that no amount of gold could settle. The final audit arrived unexpectedly in August 1503. Following a lavish dinner at a cardinal's villa, the oppressive atmospheric pressure of the Roman summer finally broke the Borgia streak. Within days, the Pope was consumed by a violent fever. The man who had spent 11 years treating the church as a personal portfolio now faced a debt he could not bribe: his own mortality. When Alexander VI breathed his last on August 18th, the Borgia brand suffered a total and instantaneous market crash. Without the central pillar of the Pope's authority, the family's assets became toxic. Cesare, himself incapacitated by illness, watched from his bed as his empire was liquidated by the very rivals he had once tried to bankrupt. The mercenary captains, whose loyalty was tied to the steady flow of papal gold, vanished as soon as the counting rooms were locked. It was a classic case of systemic liquidation. The successor, Julius II, realized that to restore the value of the papacy, he had to aggressively divest from the Borgia legacy. He didn't just reclaim their lands, he attempted to erase their history, refusing to live in the apartments decorated with their crests. Centuries later, the patterns established by Alexander VI would find echoes in the dark corners of modern industry. The Teapot Dome scandal in the American West, or the aggressive tax code manipulations of titans like Andrew Mellon, reflected the same core principle: the transmutation of public trust into private gold. The Borgia enterprise belonged to that long, corrupt lineage, where rules are treated as mere variables to be manipulated. Alexander didn't just end a dynasty. His industrial greed unwittingly planted the seeds for the Protestant Reformation. A young monk named Martin Luther would soon lead a shareholder revolt that would tear the church in half, reacting not just to theology, but to the Borgia business model of transactional salvation. In the final accounting, Alexander VI left behind a church that was physically magnificent but morally bankrupt. He had redrawn the map of the world with a pen, but he fractured the spirit of Europe with a coin. The Borgia bull was silenced, but the lessons of their reign remain as a stark warning to any power that prioritizes short-term gain over the long-term stability of the institutions they lead. The keys of St. Peter were returned to the altar, but they were permanently tarnished by the touch of the man who tried to put a price tag on the kingdom of heaven. The keys of St. Peter were returned to the altar, but they were permanently tarnished by the touch of the man who tried to put a price tag on the kingdom of heaven. While the gold from the Jubilee and the sale of red hats filled the Vatican's coffers to bursting, the House of Borgia understood that liquid wealth was only one pillar of a lasting empire. They had already restructured Lucrezia's life to secure a prestigious merger. But as Cesare Borgia's own power reached its zenith, he faced a different kind of strategic dilemma. He knew that while a kingdom is built on land and gold, a dynasty is sustained only through the public continuity of its bloodline. To understand the ultimate fragility of the Borgia machine, we must look past the battlefield and into the shadows of Cesare's private life, where the family's future was being traded for the preservation of a temporary, invincible image. Chapter 7. Off-Balance Sheet Heirs, the Governance Gap. In the year 1500, the House of Borgia appeared to have achieved what every great dynasty craved: total vertical integration. Alexander VI controlled the spiritual gateway to heaven, while Cesare controlled the iron and steel of the Italian plains. But as the family looked toward the future, they faced a silent, internal crisis. While a kingdom is built on land and gold, a dynasty is sustained only through the public continuity of its bloodline. For Cesare Borgia, however, the very existence of his heirs, Girolamo and Lucrezia, became a secret that had to be buried to protect the valuation of his political brand. Cesare was a man who lived by a myth of his own making. To the monarchs of Europe, he was the Valentinois, a storm of nature, a commander with no personal attachments that could be exploited. In his mind, an unshielded child was a point of vulnerability, a liability that could be kidnapped by a rival duke or used as a pawn in a hostile negotiation. Therefore, while other princes showcased their heirs to signal stability and longevity. Cesare chose a path of absolute concealment. He treated his children like a hidden reserve of private equity, kept off the official records to ensure they could never be used against him. The births of these children occurred not in the marble halls of the Vatican, but in the damp shadows of remote villas. Their arrivals were managed with the same cold-blooded precision as a military strike. Midwives were paid in heavy silver to forget faces. Carriages moved only in the pre-dawn mist, and the infants were whisked away to families whose loyalty was secured by a heavy retainer of Borgia gold. By denying his children their name, Cesare was protecting his immediate career, but he was also orphaning his own empire. This strategy created a profound governance gap. In a traditional dynasty, the upbringing of a child is a public investment in the future. Heirs are taught the art of the court and introduced to the networks of power they will one day inherit. But Girolamo and Lucrezia were being raised in a vacuum. They were learning their prayers in secluded cloisters, utterly disconnected from the military machines and financial ledgers their father had spent blood to build. Cesare was successfully protecting the Borgia brand from scandal, but in doing so, he was ensuring that the brand had no one to lead it once the founder was gone. The true cost of this concealment was the lack of an exit strategy. Every ducat spent to keep a child hidden was a ducat that failed to build a lasting legacy. Cesare was building a high-speed engine with no replacement parts. He was banking everything on his own survival, assuming he would have the time to legalize his family later, when the wars were won. But in the volatile market of the Renaissance, time was a luxury no man truly owned. By keeping his heirs invisible, Cesare had ensured that the Borgia Empire was a one-generation project, a spectacular firework that would leave no light behind once the initial spark had faded into the dark. While Cesare's efforts in 1500 were focused on protecting the long-term future of his brand, the Borgias had actually learned the art of crisis management 3 years earlier to understand the family's first true tactical purge. We must travel back to 1497, the year a hidden liability threatened to bankrupt their diplomatic credit before the empire had even reached its peak. While Cesare's armies were busy redrawing the borders of Italy, a second, more shadow-like organization was operating behind the scenes. This wasn't an army of soldiers, but a network of keepers, midwives, couriers, and abbesses, whose only job was to ensure that the existence of Cesare's children never became public currency. In the ruthless theater of Rome, a secret is only as safe as the person who holds it. And for the Borgias, silence was a commodity that had to be purchased at a premium every single day, every month. Heavy purses of gold florins left the Vatican, traveling not to mercenary camps, but to humble cottages in Forlì and secluded convents on the fringes of the empire. These payments were the invisible taxes of Cesare's ambition. He understood that if Girolamo or the young Lucrezia were ever identified, they would immediately become targets, not just for assassins, but for political blackmailers. A rival family could kidnap a child and demand a fortress as ransom, or a hostile diplomat could use the proof of these children to shatter Cesare's carefully crafted image of a man focused solely on the state. To manage this risk, Cesare constructed a human labyrinth. He didn't just hide the children, he fragmented their identities. They were placed with families who were deeply indebted to the Borgias, people whose own survival depended on their loyalty. These guardians were the buffers in the system. They were given enough wealth to live comfortably, but not enough to become independent of Cesare's protection. It was a perfect, if fragile, balance of gratitude and fear. The children grew up in a gilded cage of anonymity, their letters and lessons paid for by a father who could never visit them, lest his shadow on their doorstep betray their location. This architecture of silence created a profound void in the family's legacy. In other great dynasties, the upbringing of an heir is a public ritual designed to build confidence in the future. Princes are seen riding beside their fathers. They are introduced to ambassadors and taught the art of the court. But for Girolamo and Lucrezia, there were no public introductions. They were being raised in a vacuum, disconnected from the very power structure they were born to inherit. Cesare was successfully protecting his children from his enemies, but in doing so, he was also orphaning them from their own heritage. The true cost of this silence became apparent whenever a leak occurred. A loose-tongued servant or a curious neighbor in a village near Cesena, could trigger a swift and brutal response. Cesare's lieutenants were known to move like ghosts in the night, using silver to buy a tattletale's silence or a dagger to ensure it. These were the emergency costs of a secret life. For the Borgias, the truth was a liability that had to be managed with the same cold-blooded precision as a siege. They proved that you can indeed build a world in the shadows, but such a world requires a constant infusion of gold and blood to keep the light of discovery at bay. The ultimate failure of any secret system is that it requires a living master to maintain its pulse. In August 1503, when the key man Alexander VI died and Cesare fell into a fevered incapacitation, the silent machinery protecting the hidden heirs began to seize. In the cold world of power, when the checks stop clearing and the protector vanishes, loyalty dissolves as quickly as morning mist. The guardians who had been paid in heavy silver to keep Girolamo and Lucrezia hidden now faced a terrifying dilemma. Was it more profitable to stay silent or to sell the secret to the highest bidder? For years, the Borgias had treated these children as a frozen reserve for the future. But without a public name and a legal standing, the children were nothing more than ghosts in the eyes of the new administration. As Pope Julius II moved to repossess every hard asset the Borgias owned, their fortresses, their cannons, and their lands, the soft assets, the children, were simply deleted from the ledger. The vast network of stipends and bribes that had kept them safe was abruptly liquidated. The convents and remote villas that once received gold for their silence now saw only empty roads. The fate of these children serves as a grim epilogue to the family's short-term strategy. Girolamo and Lucrezia were the collateral damage of a dynasty that prioritized the image of the founder over the stability of the bloodline. Because they had never been integrated into the public life of the state, they had no market value when the Borgia brand crashed. They couldn't be used to forge new alliances or reclaim lost territories. They were essentially stranded assets, noble blood trapped in commoners' clothing, with no path back to the power they were born from. In the end, Cesare's meticulous concealment proved to be a self-fulfilling prophecy of erasure. By refusing to let his children step into the light while he reigned, he ensured they remained in the dark forever once he fell. The boys who might have been dukes and the girls who might have been queens faded into the gray background of history, becoming minor notes in provincial church registries. The Borgia Empire was a spectacular firework, bright, loud, and blinding, but because it lacked a foundation of public, legitimate succession, it left behind only smoke. The House of Borgia was a business of the present that forgot to invest in the future. And in the ledgers of history, that is the most expensive mistake a family can ever make. By treating their heirs as liabilities rather than assets, they had effectively ensured that there would be no one to claim the firm's equity once the founders were gone. This fragile, high-growth startup was now heading toward a market crash that no amount of gold could prevent. The Borgias had lived for the moment, and in August 1503, the moment finally ran out. Chapter 8. The Black Swan, a total systemic collapse. In August 1503, the House of Borgia faced its ultimate Black Swan event. In the suffocating heat of a Roman summer, the family's entire leadership structure was struck down simultaneously. Both the chairman, Pope Alexander VI, and the managing director, Cesare Borgia, fell violently ill after a single fateful banquet. In a modern corporation, a robust succession plan would have activated immediately to stabilize the firm. But the Borgia Empire was a single key operation. It was built not on an institution, but on the pulse of one man. When Alexander VI took his final breath on August 18th, the family's political and financial credit was instantly called in by every rival in Europe. The collapse that followed was a masterclass in systemic contagion. Within hours of the Pope's death, the mercenary captains, the family's primary service providers, realized the payroll was frozen. Without a living pope to authorize the flow of gold, their loyalty evaporated. Cesare, still shivering with fever, watched from his bed as his territorial portfolio in the Romagna was dismantled in a series of hostile takeovers by local lords. While his empire crumbled, his own body became a horrific mirror of his reign. By this time, the French pox, syphilis, had ravaged Cesare's once handsome face. to hide the disfiguring sores. He began wearing a black silk mask in public, transforming from a golden prince into a phantom. He ruled the dying days of his empire from the shadows, hiding the rot that was consuming him from the inside out. The Borgias had spent years accumulating hard assets, like castles and cannons, but they had neglected the soft assets of genuine legitimacy and public trust. When the central bank, the papacy, went under new management, the Borgia stock fell to zero. The arrival of Pope Julius II signaled the final foreclosure of the brand. Julius was the equivalent of a vulture capitalist whose primary goal was to liquidate the Borgia legacy entirely to restore the market value of the church. He moved out of the Borgia apartments, declaring their frescoes cursed and their treaties null and void. Every contract and title granted under Alexander's reign was struck from the ledger. Cesare Borgia, once the most feared man in Italy, was now reduced to a bad debt. He was arrested, his remaining funds were seized, and he was eventually exiled to a dusty trench in Spain, where he died in a minor skirmish. A spectacular fall for a man who once aimed to be the sole proprietor of a unified Italy, but his enemies denied him even the dignity of a quiet grave. Years later, a bishop ordered Cesare's tomb destroyed, declaring a degenerate should not rest in hallowed ground. His bones were reburied beneath a busy street outside the church, so that, in a final act of poetic justice, men and beasts would trample upon the face of the man who once forced Italy to kneel. The man who adopted the motto Caesar or nothing ultimately became dust under the feet of strangers. The Borgias had mastered the art of the short-term gain, but they failed the most important test of any enterprise: sustainability. They had built a mountain of gold on a foundation of sand, and when the tide of history turned, the mountain didn't just shrink, it vanished. 5 centuries later, the Borgia Audit offers a chilling lesson for the modern world. It serves as a reminder that unchecked growth without institutional governance is merely a countdown to a crash. A brand built on the destruction of trust eventually pays a default interest rate that bankrolls its own destruction. Cesare knew that conquering a market was useless if you couldn't monetize it. Immediately after seizing the Romagna, he established a centralized court system, the Rota, to bypass local corruption and ensure tax revenues flowed directly to his coffers. He was performing a brutal but efficient post-merger integration, streamlining operations to turn a chaotic collection of fiefdoms into a single, cash flow positive state. However, the House of Borgia ultimately left behind a dividend they never intended. Their aggressive centralization of power forced the rest of Europe to evolve. Cesare's cold, calculated tactics inspired Niccolò Machiavelli to write The Prince, the first manual for modern political science. Meanwhile, Alexander's industrial-scale corruption triggered the shareholder revolt known as the Reformation, a systemic reaction to the Borgia business model. They were history's ultimate disruptors, breaking the old world so thoroughly that a new, more regulated one had to be built in its place. In the final ledger, the House of Borgia stands as a stark warning. Power is merely a short-term loan, and the price of immortality is always higher than any treasure a man can hoard. The final balance. Lessons from a bankrupt dynasty. As the last echoes of the Borgia bull fade into the halls of history, we are left with more than just a tale of greed and conquest. We are left with a blueprint of how empires are built and why they fall. The House of Borgia was a meteor that burned bright across the Italian sky, proving that while gold can buy a throne and steel can carve a kingdom, neither can purchase the one thing a dynasty truly needs to survive: a future. Rodrigo, Cesare, and Lucrezia were architects of the present. They lived in a world of immediate transaction where power was a commodity and loyalty was a debt. But as we have seen, a legacy built on the shifting sands of a single man's heartbeat is a fragile thing. When the light of Alexander's life went out, the shadows he had spent a lifetime creating simply swallowed his children whole. History teaches us that the greatest investments are not those found in chests of gold, but in the trust we build and the institutions we leave behind. The Borgias may have lost their empire, but in their spectacular failure, they gave the world a lesson that remains unpaid to this day. Thank you for journeying through the shadows of the Vatican with us today. If you found value in this audit of history, consider subscribing to join our next expedition into the vaults of power. For now, the candles are low, the ink is dry, and the accounts are closed.